Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Orts, and I'm with the CEO Roundtable, host of today's webinar. At the CEO Roundtable, our mission is to support growth-minded business leaders by providing a platform for the exchange of knowledge, insights, and best practices that drive success and growth in our respective industries. Thank you for joining us for this important session on cybersecurity. It's a critical topic in today's digital landscape. This is being recorded, and a link to the recording and slides will be sent to all participants. This webinar would not be possible without the invaluable support and expertise of our strategic alliances and partners. And it is with deep gratitude that we thank our presenting partners. Eric Onderdonk from Wipfli, an accounting technology risk outsourcing services firm. Zach Freeman with Christensen Group Insurance. Scott Blake from Fellhaber Larson, attorney at law, Pete Odell with Platinum Bank, and Reed Johnston of Teal, a managed IT services company. Their expertise is instrumental in helping us navigate the complexities of cybersecurity and ensuring that we are all better prepared to protect our organization. Each presentation will be followed by 5 minutes of Q&A. Please capture your questions in the chat, and the presenter will answer all that they are able to in those 5 minutes. Knowing that we may not have time for everyone's questions, our follow-up email will include their contact information, so please do not hesitate to reach out to them directly. Once again, thank you for being here. There is an abundance of valuable information coming your way, so let's get started. I would like to first introduce Eric Onderdonk, Senior Manager of Wipfli's Technology Consulting and Cybertech Advisory Services. Take it away, Eric.
Lisa, let's see if I get there we go. There we go. Well, thanks for attending today. Just a quick introduction of myself. As Lisa said, I work for Wipfli. Wipfli is a professional services firm. We provide a wide range of service, including tax audit, advisory, accounting, technology, risk, outsourcing, and more. I personally manage a team that provides security testing services, including vulnerability penetration and social engineering testing. And we have a group that helps clients assess and improve their information security programs. Today, we're here to talk about cybersecurity and what you should be aware of and what you can do to improve your organization's maturity and reduce the risk to your organization. Just as a reminder or recap, you probably heard a lot of these items and it's probably the reason you're here, but I'd like to recap some of the key themes about why managing the risk of cybersecurity is important and the key impact on your businesses and organizations. If managing cybersecurity is important if you don't, there's potential key impacts on your organization, including direct financial loss. That could include theft, fraud, paying a ransom, fixing or replacing systems that are impacted, credit monitoring for customers. So there's financial impacts. There's reputational damage, breach of sensitive information. Your customers and your business partners are trusting you to hold their information securely. Operational disruption, having systems offline and needing repair, business productivity of your team, your ability to provide your services to your customers. Competitive advantage, credit impact, increased insurance premiums. We'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation today. Longer-term financial impact, including loss of intellectual property, the cost of implementing and maintaining increased security measures, and then regulatory and legal expenses. So just to recap, it's important to manage your information security, your cybersecurity, and to be on top of it. So kind of the theme on this slide is attacks come in from multiple types of attack and attack actors, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple of slides. Criminals are taking advantage of weaknesses in your environments. They're technical vulnerabilities, making sure your systems are up to date, making sure your security controls are appropriate for the risk to your organization. And then there's human weaknesses, things that the human element and criminals trying to take advantage and tricking people into that. I think one of the key takeaways, and we're all aware of that, is there's a large human element to cybersecurity. That includes, someone trying to trick somebody. Somebody clicked on a link. They provided sensitive information inappropriately. They visited a malicious website and opened themselves up for ransomware. They disclosed their user ID or password. Another key area of human risk is in the area of bad passwords. Having weak passwords. Your passwords are your key to your resources and the key to your kingdom. And so having appropriate password management hygiene is important. It could be weak passwords. It could be reuse of passwords that are used on across sites. Maybe there was a site, maybe you had the same password on your LinkedIn and your own corporate login. And LinkedIn had a data breach that exposes you to potential using that weak password to gain unauthorized access to your systems. Or someone made a mistake. They provided sensitive information. They got tricked. They provided information to someone who said they were somebody that they're not. They sent an email to the wrong person, or they sent an email via unsecure with sensitive information insecurely. Or they lost their laptop or their mobile device, or they didn't lock their screen when they walked away from the computer. So there's a huge social impact as well. So how do you protect your organization? I think the message is there isn't one thing you can do. It's going to depend on your risk profile. It's going to depend on what are the threats that are going to impact your organization. What do you need to protect? What are your critical assets? What's important to you? What are your crown jewels? So the approach is going to depend on your industry, the type of services you provide, the type of information you hold, the type of internet-facing technology you have. That will all make up the decisions that you need to make. Fortunately, today we've got a group of people that will present different ways to think about cybersecurity and different ways to protect yourself and be aware of the issues related to cybersecurity. All right, let's see. There we go. Who's behind the attacks? So cyber criminals are behind the attacks. They're for various reasons. There's different motivations and different groups, different motivations. And it's important to think about the motivations as you prepare to protect your organization from a cyber perspective. The number one, by far, group that's trying to take advantage and gain by cyber crime is organized crime. It's actors acting on behalf of trying to, get money, get your money, get your assets, get information. They do that by different ways. It could be ransomware. They're doing a ransom to directly get money from you by locking up your systems and not allowing access unless you pay a ransom. They're using theft and fraud to try to get your money through ACH or wire transactions, or get you to wire things to the wrong account. We'll talk a little bit more about that later today. The other thing is they try to exfiltrate your data. There's a whole black market for selling information, selling your information, selling credit cards, selling PII, selling social security numbers. There's a whole black market associated with that, with direct financial gain for actors. Another area of concern is nation states. Now, nation states, they may fund threat actor groups to perform a variety of malicious activities on networks around the world. Their objectives typically are espionage or cyber warfare, gain of information about your organization, about the industries that you're involved in, ability to provide an attack platform to attack critical infrastructure and institutions, and also financial gain. The thing about nation states, they're highly resourced. They are very persistent. They can get in your network. There's not a lot you can do about some of the types of attacks. The different actors there include the Chinese government, Russian government, North Korean government. They all have different motivations, but their goal is to gain information and potentially disrupt your networks. There's terrorist groups. Their goal is to cause harm and destruction that furthers their cause. But that can also be a way to gain revenue to fund their operations. So they can have a financial motivation as well as a activist motivation. The next group is hacktivists. They're trying to they're black hackers. They're trying to further their political or ethical objectives. It could be free speech or human rights violations. They target particular individual, organization, or government agencies to promote their cause. And the last item is there's a lot of people that are, not a huge amount as far as impacts on business, but script kiddies, people that are providing, they're getting information. You can buy code, you can buy attacks, you can buy ransomware on the dark black market. So people use that. That tends to be more amateur, not as professional, and they're more easily spotted and detected and averted from their goals. So next slide here. Oh. Okay, breach statistics. So the theme here, based on the IBM cost of a data breach report in 2023, is the average cost of a data breach has reached an all-time high in 2023. It ends up being about $4.5 million, which is a tripling in over the last 5 years. That includes all organizations from very small to very large, so that's an average across. We'll talk a little bit about, when we're talking about cyber insurance, what some of those average figures are for the various sizes of organization. But the bottom line here is it's expensive. The hard costs associated with the data breach, as I mentioned, include, ransom payment, cleanup and remediation, customer notification, professional services, including legal, forensics, public relations, and IT. As far as the threat actors go, organized crime is the highest number, the highest percentage of the threat actor. It's really financial motivation. Espionage, there's to some degree, but it's really organized crime, as I mentioned on the previous slide. And then as far as how breaches are enacted, for the most part, you'll see that 2/3 of the types of attacks involve some kind of a social or human element. That includes use of stolen credentials or misdelivery, mistakes that people make, as I mentioned earlier. Pretexting, pretending to be somebody you're not, trying to get somebody to click on an inappropriate link, or phishing. And what's interesting to me is, for all of the time and effort we spend on technology implementations, which is important, direct exploitation of vulnerabilities is a rather small amount of the percentage. Usually that's the attack it could include a technical vulnerability as well as a lack of a control, and typically the use of some kind of a social engineering or taking advantage of the human element. All right, as far as timeliness, one other point I want to make today is that the average time that an attacker is in a network before they're discovered is over 200 days. So for half a year, a typical attacker is on your network, gaining information about your network and causing damage or assessing how to attack your network effectively. That could be, the things that they would do could be searching for vulnerabilities on your internal network, trying to exploit weaknesses to gain further unauthorized access, trying to exfiltrate data, pulling data off your systems if they gain unauthorized access. And then things that they do is increasing the likelihood that if it's a ransomware attack, that you won't be able to avoid paying ransom. So things like trying to disable your backups or put corruption or put malware and corrupt the data on your backups. Try to cripple your organization and decrease the likelihood that you'll be able to not pay a ransom. So it sounds like an uphill battle, but what is your organization to do? Well, we're here today to hear from some of the experts to provide additional perspectives to allow you to, better understand your risks. What are the risks for your particular organization? How to prepare your organization to better detect and defend. And then to understand the resources you have from a legal, financial, and a cyber insurance perspective. I'll just briefly review the speakers that'll be speaking today. So Reed will be talking about information on best cyber practices to follow to protect your organization. Scott Blake will be talking from a legal perspective, discussing data breach and notification considerations, reviewing personal identifiable information. Pete will be reviewing cyber from a banking perspective, banking business email compromise, reviewing examples of how fraudsters target wire transfers, ACH, vendors, and check fraud. And Zach will be talking from a perspective of cybersecurity insurance, reviewing your cybersecurity insurance and considerations you have, things to consider when you're choosing a security provider. So that said, let's open it up for questions.
Let's move right on into the next tech presentation for Reed.
Sounds great. Thank you. Right, I think I've got control here. Well, hi everyone, I'm Reed Johnston. I am I'm a co-founder at Teal. We provide managed IT services for small businesses. I lead our technology strategy and client management. I've been working in IT services for about more than 20 years at this point. And today I'm going to go over some best practices that organizations can take to help keep their systems, their accounts, and their data safe. So we'll move right into that. Let's see if I can click. There we go. Perfect. So the first thing I want to start off with is your inventory. You can't protect what you don't know that you have. So you really want to have a good understanding of the inventory of your environment. So that is your computers, your mobile devices like your cell phones, anywhere that you're storing data like external drives. You want to have an understanding of what software is installed on what machines, who's using what software, what is the purpose of that software, and you want to understand what users have access to your data and where is that data located and how is it classified? Is the data very confidential, highly sensitive, that contains personally identifiable information, which we'll talk about later today? Or is it just run-of-the-mill work-in-process data that doesn't have any confidential nature to it? So first you want to understand what you're protecting. So now I'll click to the next slide here. From there, you want to establish kind of how am I going to go about taking care of my cybersecurity? And you don't need to reinvent the wheel because there are numerous frameworks that are available that can help an organization really tackle this. The National Institute of Standards and Technology has their cybersecurity framework. NIST offers a small business quick start guide, which really will give you a roadmap of how to get started, how to tackle the different components of the cybersecurity framework, which they've broken down to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. The Getting Started guide will help you understand what parts of the organization can impact those different pieces. There's also the Center for Internet Security. They've recently released their updated version 8 of their critical security controls. And they give a really nice layout of here are the things that you should be doing, here are the different groups that should be involved. And you could, of course, work towards a third-party auditable certification like ISO 27001, or you could look to work towards a SOC 2 attestation. Going through those processes will basically have policies and procedures that you can implement to help tackle these different pieces. But when you establish policies and procedures, you want to regularly review them. You want to update them annually. You want to train your team, make them aware that those policies exist, make them aware of their role in protecting your environment and how they can help keep your systems safe. Policies and procedures moves into awareness training. And awareness training is really important from the standpoint of educating your team members on how to be aware of what a phishing email might look like. What are those red flags to look out for? Many organizations that we talk with They do a annual training, and it's like a brain dump for everybody. And we try to recommend an alternate approach. We recommend monthly training that's short, or quarterly training, to keep things top of mind. On top of that, when you bring a new person into your organization, you want to get this security awareness training in front of them right away, because some of the tactics that the attackers are using are targeting those new hires, trying to socially engineer them or trick them into doing things like buying gift cards, getting a text message from the CEO to buy a gift card, as an example. I've got a statistic here from the Verizon data breach investigation report that 68% of breaches involve some human element. So that's really interesting to consider, that the more that we can be aware of how we can help impact security within our organizations, the more secure we will be. On the theme of security, we need to understand where our vulnerabilities are. And those vulnerabilities are not just within your computers. You want to be thinking about, did we make changes to our IT environment, like our firewall, opening up ports to allow traffic into our network? Did we make security permission changes within a cloud service that we're using that allow an external group to access a portion of our data? Vulnerability scanning is something that you should do regularly to help you understand where are those open doors, or where are those weak locks, so to speak, in your environment. And as we have so many employees that are working remotely, they're not necessarily behind your corporate firewall. They're working from their home office, they're working from a coffee shop or other places, and you want to leverage technology that can allow you to scan for vulnerabilities on their systems too. That takes me into patching. Patching is really important. It should be an automatic process within your organization. There are numerous technologies that are available to automatically install software patches on your computers, both Mac and PC. But we also want to be thinking about the other software that's in our environment, software applications like maybe Adobe products, or line of business applications like QuickBooks or Sage. You want to be aware that those companies are releasing updates as well, and some of those patches that they make available will fix a critical security issue that they've identified. So you can subscribe to notification lists from hardware vendors, from software vendors, to be aware of when these things are coming out that are critical. But you also don't want to forget about the other devices in your environment, like your firewalls, your switches, printers, copiers. You want to look at the total environment as far as what needs to be updated, not just the software that's running on your computers. Next, we have strong authentication, and this is especially important because your access to your system is only as strong as the passwords and the authentication mechanisms to get in. So the first thing that I always recommend is you've got to use a password manager. You can't be reusing passwords across all the different websites and systems that you access, and it's human nature to try to remember a password and use it in different places, but the attackers know this, and they will identify, like Eric said, that if they can get into your LinkedIn account, that you may be using that same password to get into your Gmail account, and they'll try to exploit that. So we always recommend a password manager. Many people say, well, I'm just using my browser. My browser will store my passwords. Well, that's a very insecure way of storing passwords, because your browser has vulnerabilities in it, and an attacker that gains access to your system can dump those passwords out of your browser. Additionally, you want to make sure that you're rotating passwords whenever possible. So many organizations have policies to rotate passwords on a 90-day cycle, or a 180-day cycle, or an annual cycle. The best place you can be is having multi-factor authentication on top of a password, but for those accounts that you can't configure multi-factor authentication, you want to rotate those passwords. And in the news recently, we've been hearing a lot about phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. Just know that there are multiple types of multi-factor authentication. There's text messages that you can receive, there's authentication apps that you can use on your mobile devices, and then there's hardware devices that you can plug in that are known as phishing resistant that can help protect your accounts as well. Let me go. Next is encryption. So encryption is becoming and has become more second nature as the companies like Google and Microsoft are highlighting websites that we're visiting with that little padlock. That's a sign that you have encryption in transit. But you really want to be thinking about, is the data that's sitting on my device, like my laptop or my cell phone, protected? Modern cell phones, particularly Apple and Android phones, when you establish a password, you are encrypting the data at rest. But many laptops, many computers that are in our environment may not use encryption at rest unless IT has configured it. So you want to make sure that your data is protected. So if someone steals that laptop out of your car, they can't just pull the hard drive out and access that data. If you're using encryption at rest, that data is protected. One of the things that we run into a lot is people will email encrypted files to one another, and then they'll send a second email with the password to that encrypted file. So we always recommend to keep those encryption keys separate. Don't use the same medium to deliver the encryption password. Send a text message or make a voice call to that person so that they can have that information securely, and it's not just a second email that shows up in their inbox. Next, we have advanced monitoring, and it's one thing to have an alert that you're getting or an alarm system in your office, but it's another thing to have a team that's monitoring that alert or monitoring that alarm system and can immediately engage when something happens. So you want to leverage, these are called a security operations center, also managed detection and response services, that will receive the alerts that are coming in from these security tools that are deployed in your environment and can intervene on those alerts 24/7. So for example, say I'm traveling and I sign into my Microsoft account, I'm in Florida, and then there's a sign in from another country a few minutes later. That security operations center, that managed detection response team should be able to see that type of alert and immediately intervene to lock out my account to prevent that geographically impossible travel from occurring. So you want to leverage advanced monitoring in your environment to protect against bad access. And then finally, I want to talk about backups. Your data is the most important part of the equation here. Your backups should be automatic. That's not something that you should have to think about doing every day because there will always be other priorities that come up. Don't just think about your servers that require backup. Think about your cloud services like Office 365 and Google. Those services do not automatically have backup. So you want to include third-party services to protect your cloud data. And I like to say that the only successful backup is a tested one. So don't rely on the messages that just say your backup is successful. Actually restore your data on a regular basis, be it monthly or quarterly, to validate that you can restore your data and you're getting the data back that you intend on getting back from those backups. And finally, have multiple backup strategies. Don't just rely on one system backing up to one location. You want to have a local backup in your environment. You should have a third-party backup that is totally disconnected from your environment. And then you may want to consider having point-in-time backups that are totally separate from that offsite backup. That way you have multiple ways that you can get back to the most important thing, and that is the data that is within your organization. So with that, I'll move into the Q&A and 5-minute break, I think, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you. Reed, that was a really great checklist of all things to go back and look to know that we're doing everything possible for our organization. I'm going to open it up to participants and attendees. Are there any questions for Reed? He talked about a lot of different
Through a lot of stuff
facets
there.
yeah, a lot of different facets from your inventory of your assets to be protected to the backups to encryption. I'm gonna open it up for questions.
I have a quick question. This is Nicole, by the way. My question is, this is a really great, to-do list. Do you have, and maybe this will be shared a little bit later, resources, really good resources? Okay, so we want to do, password manager. Where should we go to find a password manager? What's a good password manager to use? Or, in terms of backing up, what are some good services for that? Or anyways, so just wondering if you have resources as well to offer.
Sure. As far as how to go about the different pieces, we'll be sure to include links and information to the NIST CSF and to the CIS getting started information. That way, that'll give you the framework of kind of where to go. When you look at comparing different types of products to do different things, there are review sites that can help, and that's where we can help clients as well really identify what's best for our organization. But getting started with the frameworks, I think, is the best case because they really lay out, here are the things you should be thinking about. And then it's just a matter of iteratively going through that over time and slowly improving in different areas where it makes sense for your organization.
Thanks, Reed.
You bet.
I had a question. This is Earl Ott. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. As far as cloud backup is concerned, and you mentioned third-party groups, really the only cloud stuff that we have is we have a hosted company for our files, and I've negotiated backups obviously with them. But as far as Office 365 is concerned, are you suggesting that Microsoft does not back up our emails?
Yeah, that's actually correct. It's in the fine print. They provide some geo redundancy, but they don't provide backup. So we always recommend engaging a third party to connect to your Microsoft tenant and then replicate that data outside of your Microsoft tenant. It was just in the news, I think recently it was Google or some other provider deleted a bunch of data of one of their customers, I think inadvertently. But yeah, you want to leverage a third-party cloud backup with cloud providers that you're using. So that's Google, that's Microsoft as well.
Okay, that's great. One other question. You had talked about at-rest encryption. I've never heard that term before. Could you define that for me, please?
Yep. So at-rest encryption it's encrypting the data on that hard drive, as an example. So if my laptop is stolen out of my car and someone takes that hard drive out of the laptop, they can't plug it into a computer to access the contents of that hard drive. That's at-rest encryption.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yep.
Good questions. Thank you. Anyone else? We are actually ahead of schedule, so I would like to move into our next section and we can take a break after that, if that's okay. So I'd like to introduce, there we go, Scott Blake from Fellhaber Larson, and he will speak to laws and policy and ways to protect yourself. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. So my name is Scott Blake. I'm an attorney at Fellhaber Larson. And one of the areas that I focus on is helping clients deal with cybersecurity issues typically when there's a breach event. And there's a whole host of issues and laws that need to be on your radars if there's a cybersecurity event. I'm going to go through some of those as part of this presentation. Jenny, do I have control of the slide or do you? There we go. So at a high level, okay, so some of the other presenters have talked about, high level security issues and what hackers are out to get, right? But just to reiterate, what type of information can be stolen or accessed as part of a cyber breach? Obviously, trade secrets and confidential business information. You always hear news stories about, for example, like the Chinese government stealing confidential business information of large companies, stealing their IP to make their own products. Pricing information, customer lists, and then I highlighted health records or PHI because there's certain regulations under HIPAA. So if your organization deals with health records, there's a lot of rules and regulations related to that, and that can certainly be stolen. And then also personally identifiable information in bank accounts and credit cards, right? So that's going to be the most common stuff that's accessed, particularly the credit card information or bank account information, because hackers are most likely after your money. And then also login and passwords. And the login and passwords are used a lot to have, a lot of times they want to gain access to stuff, and then they'll send out fake emails, phishing emails from users' accounts to other people to try to get access to other systems. Next slide, please. So what legal standards do you have to pay attention to? At a high level, a lot. There's a lot of different laws out there, and here's a list of a number of them, and it's highly industry and business specific. And so, today we don't have time to go over each of these, but the point to know is that depending on what you do, there could be particular laws that apply to you, and then there's some broader laws. So like the FTC has broad laws that are applied to many, if not all, businesses. I'm going to talk about data breach notification laws. And again, each state has these data breach notification laws that apply to basically anyone that's doing business in that state. But then there's specific ones. And so if you find yourself in one of those industries, it's important to consult with legal counsel and as well as your IT service provider to make sure that you know what those standards are. And it's better to know what the standards are at the outset and build a business plan and a cybersecurity plan, knowing what the rules and regulations are, as opposed to figuring it out after a cyber breach happens and then sort of be in responsive mode. Next slide, please. And so, sorry, next slide, Jenny. There we go. So in addition to, there's a bit of a double whammy if you got, if you're subject to a cyber breach, right? As Eric was talking about, there's obviously a massive cost in responding to a cybersecurity breach, right? So you're gonna have like the cost of actually like identifying what happened and getting the hacker out of your system. And then if they steal confidential business information, or if there's any other type of business harm, out-of-pocket business harm, that's obviously a cost. Next slide, Jenny. But then also there are fines and penalties that all the various laws may impose on you, or governmental agencies may impose on you. So the FTC, the SEC, FINRA, the Justice Department, all these governmental entities, in many instances have authority to issue fines and penalties. So not only is there a risk of out-of-pocket damages that your business incurs, but then there could be like a second wave of fines if you haven't made sure that your business complies with those many laws that were on the prior slide. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about how you can contract to limit the threat here, and then I'm going to talk about sort of like a step list of what happens or what you should do when a breach occurs. So the first thing, how can you protect yourself from a legal end on the front end? And a lot of companies are going to contract with various vendors or service providers to provide services to them, right? And those vendors, or maybe you're a vendor, but those vendors are going to have access to either your IT systems or your confidential information. And so there are things you can do in contracts to protect yourself. So the first is in a written first of all, have a written contract with your vendors. But in it, you can have representations and warranties or other requirements talk about what requirements that vendor has to have with respect to IT, right? And there's various security standards out there that any company can adopt that are sort of like a best practices. And so in your contract, you can say, look, you have to comply with the security requirement if you're going to do business with us. And then some type of certification process that they report to you that, yes, indeed, they are complying with those certifications. The second thing is having some type of indemnity or notice provision in the contract. So if the vendor has a cyber breach, which compromises your data, they or any other type of cyber breach that causes harm to you, in the cyber world, they agree to indemnify you and defend you with respect to any loss. And then also a notice provision. So if they become aware of a cyber breach of an area of their IT system, which may contain some of your information, that they are required contractually to notify you so that you can evaluate the situation and take any action that you have to do. And then the last thing is insurance. We're going to talk about insurance a little bit later on about insurance that you can have, but then in the contract require your vendors to have cybersecurity insurance. So in addition to it, like, you typically see like a CGL policy terms in an agreement, but also add that extra sentence that says you got to have a cyber insurance policy if you want to do business with us. Next slide, please, Jenny. So this slide should be titled responding to a breach, so I apologize for that. But okay, so you have a breach, something happens, someone comes to you and says, hey, I think we got an issue. What do you do? And this is an abridged slide. If we had more time, each one of these bullet points is 3 to 5 slides each, so this is very high level. But the first thing you should do is go, okay, let's look at our incident response plan. What is an incident response plan, you ask? It is a best practice to, when things are good, when nothing has happened, you create a business plan or an incident response plan that sort of gets your ducks in a row. And so it should be comprised of a few things. The first thing is, who are you going to call, right? So who's your attorney, who you're going to call once it happens? Who's your IT vendor that maybe manages your IT services, or who's on your internal IT team? And then do you have a separate IT team or a third-party IT team that helps in assisting in responding to cyber breaches when they happen? So identifying them, the threat actor, how things were compromised and how to shut it down and do the remediation, right? But identify who's on that core team and then identify the steps. So if this, and it's basically the response plan is, okay, so we're going to do this. We identify the people, and then our first step is this, 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 and this. And you work with your attorney and your IT people on the front end, get the plan in place so that when the cybersecurity breach happens, you've got your game plan and your blueprint ready to go. That it is much better to have thought through all that stuff than to be entirely reactionary when the cyber breach occurs. Okay, better to have a plan than just be reactionary. So first, look at the incident response plan. Second, act immediately to limit damage and mitigate exposure, right? So cybersecurity events and breaches in the response time period happens in seconds, minutes, hours, right? Not days, weeks, months. How quickly you respond to it, how quickly you shut off the hacker's access makes a difference, because the longer they're in your system, the more risk there is that they're going to take off with other information. Third, engage outside legal counsel. The main thing is because if you engage an expert along with an IT expert, but also an attorney, you've got experts. You got your expert team who's going to help you respond. The other thing is privilege. So communications with your attorney are privileged. So once you get an attorney on board, have the attorney on the emails between you and the IT person, have the attorney on calls where you're discussing what has happened, what your responses and everything like that. And that creates a veil of protection if any lawsuit was to arise in the future or investigation by a governmental agency. Though you basically protecting your decision-making process by having an attorney there. And if you don't have an attorney there, then if there's a lawsuit or if the government comes knocking, they may ask you for copies of those emails or ask you what was discussed and how you figured out how to respond to the breach and everything like that. And so it's good to get legal counsel, obviously for the advice, but then also for that protection. The next thing, determine whether you have to notify your insurance company. So hopefully you have cyber insurance. There's typically some type of provision in any insurance policy if once you get knowledge that a claim has arisen, that you have to promptly notify your carrier so that they can get involved, make a determination as to whether there's coverage and get their people involved. So important to do that. Determine whether law enforcement needs to be notified, and then go through, does a public announcement at some point need to be made? Public announcements are typically going to be later on, when you sort of figured out what happened with the breach and what your obligations are to notify people. And then the last, evaluate reporting obligations. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit here in more detail. Jenny, next slide. So each state in the United States has a data breach notification law, and they're generally follow the same format, but they're slightly different, which makes it more burdensome for businesses to comply if they deal with information or clients in multiple states. Go back, please. But at a high level, these laws state that if you have electronic information regarding people, and there's PII, personally identifiable information, so things like bank accounts, credit card numbers, social security numbers, that type of thing. If you have PII and a hacker either gets access to or acquires that information, businesses have to notify individuals and potentially state agencies, state or federal agencies, of that. And each state law is slightly different. And what I have up here on the screen is Minnesota's. And so I just wanted to run through this and briefly here, and then talk about some of the state-specific things. So the first part here and highlighted, any person or business that conducts business in the state. So if you do business in Minnesota, you're subject to this law. Every other statute says if you do business in their state, you're subject to their laws. Shall disclose any breach of the security of the system following discovery to any resident of this state whose unencrypted personal information was or is reasonably believed to have been acquired by an unauthorized person. So if you have a cybersecurity breach, so if someone comes past your firewall and goes into your system, you have to notify the person whose information was potentially compromised. Now, Minnesota states that you have to do it in the most expedient time possible. Some states have specific time periods, like within 30 or 45 days. But the point is that some type of written notice has to be provided to the individuals. And then the second thing under B there is, okay, so what if it's not your data, if it's not your client's information, or credit card information, stuff like that. But instead, maybe you're a vendor and you house other businesses' information that then triggers their obligations. Under B, if they breach your system, then you have to notify your customer, your client, that their client's information was potentially breached. Next slide here. So what is a breach of the security system? So what is a hack? So under Minnesota, the verb is acquisition of computerized data, which compromises security of personal information. So the focus is on acquisition. Some states, it's acquisition and acquire, but really what the acquisition in practice, and I take a little bit more of a safer approach, is that means if someone got into your system. So it's not necessarily, I know the hacker took this credit card information for this person. It's the hacker got into the system where there's personally identifiable information. That's what triggers your notice obligations. Next slide, please. And then what is personal information? So in Minnesota, personal information is first name or first initial and the last name, and then any one of these three things: social security number, driver's license number, or any account number or credit card number in combination with the security code. So any type of financial bank information. Next slide here. So if those things are triggered in Minnesota, you have to provide written notice to individuals. Each individual has to get a letter. And that's, depending on the number, that can be really time consuming and costly. If the breach involves more than 500 people, you have to provide notice to all the consumer reporting agencies. Now, as I said before, there's state variants. So state law, other states have different timelines and differences regarding the type of notice that you have to provide. So some states have 35 or 30 or 45 days, a couple have 90. I think the majority have like as soon as reasonably practical or something like that, similar to Minnesota. Some have different definitions of PII. And so it may be more expansive in some states. And then there's the definitional changes as to acquisition or access. So effectively, though, when you're looking at all the states, it's if you got access, if you got into the system, you probably have to go through this process. Some other states require notice to the respective state AG, and then as well as consumer reporting agencies. And then some states even require you to pay for credit monitoring for a period, I think it's either like a year or 3 years, for individuals whose data was compromised. And so that's an additional cost because you have to pay for that credit monitoring. And then depending on your industry, specifically if you're in banking, you have to report to other federal agencies. So the FDIC or the NCUA, the National Credit Union Association, there's an immediate reporting obligation. I think it's like 36 hours from knowledge of the breach. You have to notify the FDIC and the NCUA. So be aware of that. And then there's HIPAA notification. And that itself is an entire presentation that would take, 30 minutes or so to explain through that. But if you have health information, that opens up another door of notification, both to the federal authorities as well as to individuals. And I think that's it. So I have time for Q&A here, if there are any questions.
Hey, this is Dave Faust from Platinum. I just have a question regarding if you have any stories or tales about, do you pay ransomware? Have you been involved with any clients that have done that, and the pros and cons? I know it all is situational, but just love your perspective on that and what you're seeing.
Certainly situational. I think the best advice on the ransomware is, or to prevent the situation where you're going to have to pay the ransom, is do what Reed did before, what Reed talked about before, which is to have a backup system that is up to date and routinely updated, but it's outside of the system that the hackers took control of, right? So you want to have redundancy to protect yourself. So if they lock down your main system, you say, I don't care, in 72 hours, I can be back up based on my backup. So have fun, hacker on your ransom. Now, I know there have been, you hear in the news that people are more increasingly paying the ransoms. I have two concerns about that, and I'd welcome other people's comments as well. But one, they're in your system, right? So you can pay them the $2 million or whatever it is, but they're still in their system. And the hacker says, well, if you pay us the $2 million, then we'll come out of your system. But they're hackers. They broke the law and they just held you up for ransom. I don't trust that they're going to actually get out of the system. So that's one thing. And then there's just the broader thing of, if everyone pays the ransom, they're just going to continue to do it, right? And easy to say when it's not your data in your business. But I think the general recommendation, I think if you talk to the IT guys, they're going to say, don't pay it for those reasons. And it's better to have, that ounce of prevention and have the backup systems. Zach, did you have anything to comment on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of jump in based off what you were commenting on regarding the ransomware. And, from an insurance claim perspective, what we've seen is a couple things. One is the first thing typically encrypted is the backup. So, while it's super important to have a backup and people are using the cloud and trying to segregate their information, usually they're unable to access even their backup. So that's one point. And then the other point about paying the ransom, hopefully you have robust insurance policy that'll set you up with a team that will kind of handle the ransom negotiation. And it's a fairly small world. So, this is a multi-billion-dollar business, this cyber crime. And the negotiators kind of know all the various players. And it sounds weird to say, but the criminals, if they want a specific ransom amount and it's paid and then they don't get out of the system or whatnot, like the negotiator takes that into account for the next, ransomware negotiations that they have. And it's almost like a weird ethical thing where, from what we've heard and seen, is that when the ransom is paid, they do get out of the system and move to the next one, because they don't want to be known as the group that won't get out of your system after being paid the ransom. So kind of an odd thing, but just something that we've seen in the space, and just thought I would note that.
Yeah, that's disturbingly transactional, Zach. I get it, but you know, so yeah. But and good to know that a good cyber insurance policy would cover the ransomware payment, or maybe that's something you negotiate that, you know, is that a specific thing that's negotiated, Zach? Is like ransom up to? How do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the policy limits, obviously. The carrier is not going to pay more than they're obligated to.
Yeah.
But, if you have a robust policy, you should have up to your full limit with the ransomware piece. And, the carriers are able to pay in the cryptocurrency and whatnot. We've seen situations where companies have had to kind of handle the ransomware themselves or directly, and it's been difficult for them to be able to pay the virtual currency and whatnot. So that's another piece, another reason to have the robust insurance policy.
Great. Any other questions?
Good conversation. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank
Well,
you very
thank
much.
you, Scott,
Yeah.
for that. It was very informative. Lots of detail. And the fact that you just covered Minnesota, and many businesses engage with vendors or customers, clients outside of Minnesota. So to not only take into account what they need to know from a Minnesota perspective, but also every state's.
Yeah.
So thank you. Well, let's take a 3-minute break. I said 5 before, but let's take a 3-minute break. We'll come back. We're going to jump into banking and minimizing the financial or finance related risks. And then Zach will come back and talk about insurance. So let's come back at just a couple minutes after noon. Okay, right. Okay. Let's come back together. Feel like we need some music to get everyone's attention and bring us on back. Next up is banking with Pete Odell with Platinum Bank. And I would like to turn it over to Pete.
Sounds good. You didn't get my walk-up music going? No? Okay.
We're
Like
missing
a-
that, even the music that is over break.
like a mariachi band, I think is
Mhm.
nice. So thanks everyone for joining. I'm Pete Odell with Platinum Bank. Just real quick, Platinum Bank was founded by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs, and we were founded again on the premise that business owners deserved a better level of service. And a lot of times when you think banking, we think loans and credit, but every customer, every business has a bank, and ties right into this topic of, there's a ton of fraud. I've been doing this for 25 years, and the amount of fraud that we see, or the fraud attempts, has just grown exponentially over the years. So I think this is a great forum. Lots to learn. So today, just want to run through the leading sources of fraud that we see, the types of payment fraud and the targets, 3 different real life scenarios and the different outcomes, lessons learned, best practices, and then products and ways that we can try to mitigate that as business owners. So we'll go first slide. Okay. There we go. So the main source that we've seen in the banking world that leads to fraud is business email compromise. That word has come up a couple times in the other presentations, kind of a similar theme, but that's really where the bulk of this starts. The other area that happens with this is check washing or check fraud. But you can see that the primary methods impacted by that email compromise, 45% of the losses or fraud attempts come through wire transfers, 34 in ACH credits and debits, and 16% in checks. But what this doesn't capture is that while there might be only 16% of checks that are actually go through and they create a fraud scenario, 60+% of those attempts are checks, but there's actually really good methods and tools that we can put in place to help our customers, or all of you businesses should have. That's why at 60% of attempts to only be 16% of the affected, that's a success. The targets of the payment fraud are checks, like I mentioned, credit cards, wire transfers, and ACH. I'm not going to touch on the credit cards. I think those companies have done a pretty good job of identifying fraud and have whole fraud departments to check and work algorithms of your typical spending. But we'll focus on the other 3 types. Let's see if I can. They didn't tell me there was technology involved here. All right. Let's go through a scenario here. One is this first scenario. These are actual scenarios that happened at the bank. So our customer received an email from their vendor asking them to change their payment information, included the account and routing number. Email looked legit. The bookkeeper for the company just changed the way that they made the payments. Didn't verify, didn't go out of band, didn't seek any approval internally, and made the payment to the new payment instructions. Shortly after, the vendor received an email from the fraudster pretending to be the business and said, hey, we've got a little bit of delay in our payments, kind of came up with an excuse. The vendor, who had worked with our customer for a long time, thought that was odd and reached out to the customer. Said, hey, I don't know that this is probably right, seems off for the way we've done business. Business notified the bank after that ACH was sent. We were able to recover those funds, but it took 3 months.
Great. Any other questions?
Good conversation. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank
Well,
you very
thank
much.
you, Scott,
Yeah.
for that. It was very informative. Lots of detail. And the fact that you just covered Minnesota, and many businesses engage with vendors or customers, clients outside of Minnesota. So to not only take into account what they need to know from a Minnesota perspective, but also every state's.
Yeah.
So thank you. Well, let's take a 3-minute break. I said 5 before, but let's take a 3-minute break. We'll come back. We're going to jump into banking and minimizing the financial or finance related risks. And then Zach will come back and talk about insurance. So let's come back at just a couple minutes after noon. Okay, right. Okay. Let's come back together. Feel like we need some music to get everyone's attention and bring us on back. Next up is banking with Pete Odell with Platinum Bank. And I'd like to turn it over to Pete.
Sounds good. You didn't get my walk-up music going? No? Okay.
We're missing
Okay.
that, even the music that is over break.
Like a mariachi band, I think is
Mhm.
nice. So thanks everyone for joining. I'm Pete Odell with Platinum Bank. Just real quick, Platinum Bank was founded by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs, and we were founded again on the premise that business owners deserved a better level of service. And a lot of times when you think banking, we think loans and credit, but every customer, every business has a bank, and ties right into this topic of, there's a ton of fraud. I've been doing this for 25 years, and the amount of fraud that we see, or the fraud attempts, has just grown exponentially over the years. So I think this is a great forum. Lots to learn. So today, just want to run through the leading sources of fraud that we see, the types of payment fraud and the targets, 3 different real life scenarios and the different outcomes, lessons learned, best practices, and then products and ways that we can try to mitigate that as business owners. So we'll go first slide. Okay. There we go. So the main source that we've seen in the banking world that leads to fraud is business email compromise. That word has come up a couple times in the other presentations, kind of a similar theme, but that's really where the bulk of this starts. The other area that happens with this is check washing or check fraud. But you can see that the primary methods impacted by that email compromise, 45% of the losses or fraud attempts come through wire transfers, 34 in ACH credits and debits, and 16% in checks. But what this doesn't capture is that while there might be only 16% of checks that are actually go through and they create a fraud scenario, 60+% of those attempts are checks. But there's actually really good methods and tools that we can put in place to help our customers, or all of you businesses should have. That's why at 60% of attempts to only be 16% of the affected, that's a success. The targets of the payment fraud are checks, like I mentioned, credit cards, wire transfers, and ACH. I'm not going to touch on the credit cards. I think those companies have done a pretty good job of identifying fraud and have whole fraud departments to check and work algorithms of your typical spending. But we'll focus on the other 3 types. Let's see if I can. They didn't tell me there was technology involved here. All right. Let's go through a scenario here. One is this first scenario. These are actual scenarios that happened at the bank. So our customer received an email from their vendor asking them to change their payment information, included the account and routing number. Email looked legit. The bookkeeper for the company just changed the way that they made the payments. Didn't verify, didn't go out of band, didn't seek any approval internally, and made the payment to the new payment instructions. Shortly after, the vendor received an email from the fraudster pretending to be the business and said, hey, we've got a little bit of delay in our payments, kind of came up with an excuse. The vendor, who had worked with our customer for a long time, thought that was odd and reached out to the customer. Said, hey, I don't know that this is probably right, seems off for the way we've done business. Business notified the bank after that ACH was sent. We were able to recover those funds, but it took 3 months. So that's a lot of money to be out there in the ether, especially for a small business, to try to get that back. So these are a good scenario where they made pretty quick reference to the bank. Speed counts and all of these has been mentioned by Eric in the beginning. The quicker you can get on this and let the research start, the better, and the better outcomes that we get. Our second scenario was a washed check. For those of you, if you go way back to the day of Catch Me If You Can, the Tom Hanks and Leo DiCaprio movie, this is an example where our customer issued a check. The bad guy intercepted it, washed it, and changed who the check was payable to. The customer had positive pay, and I'll explain kind of what that is if you guys aren't familiar with positive pay as we get down to the products and services. So they had a fraud prevention tool, but it didn't have payee positive pay, which means it also verifies who the check was being paid to. Vendor notified the customer, but that didn't happen until 30 days later for notification that came to the bank. The bank reached out to the clearing bank to try to retrieve those funds for our client. And we worked for 6 months and we were never able to make a recovery. So this is just a good example of how creative the fraudsters are. The bank works really hard, and we have a department that works with other banks, but there's just certain time frames. The real magic time frame is 24 hours, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in some solutions. The third scenario, and this one hurts the worst. This was a wire scenario where a customer that does a lot of international business received an email, you're noticing a trend, from their vendor changing their payment remittance to a new bank. No verification. Again, nobody called the vendor. Nobody went internal up. They didn't have good safeguards in place, and approvals for any payment changes or difference in payables. This was a series of payments over 4 months that went offshore in the wire. The total loss, no recovery, was $200,000. And those are the real hard ones for us, because we want to help and we try to educate, and obviously, well, 200,000 was a big impact for the customer and put them in a lot of stress. So the lesson learned on these, and this, I could give you 20 more scenarios, and there's been some other ones in the newspaper. There was a contractor, not a customer, so I read this in the paper, but contractor, title company, and owner, and that, I think the loss was 750,000, and now there's a business owner building a building with liens on his property because they didn't verify out of band and talk to people. So the lessons learned: never trust an email information without verifying in some out of band method, and then act quickly. Eric talked, and speed, and as Scott talked about, there's requirements on when you have to report that, but really the magic time frame is 24 hours to report it to the bank to have the best chance of recovery with checks and ACH and wires. So reviewing your account activity daily is really important. Bank reconciliation, and then implementing fraud tools that we'll talk about in a little bit. And then there's a key phrase in here: is use them the way that they're intended to be used. As folks running small businesses, we're doing many things at the same time, and it's not always easy to go in and reconcile your account or wearing many hats. But super important that somebody looks through those accounts, even with these tools, on a daily basis. Best practices to help fight this: ongoing employee training, define what the fraud is and the consequences. We can, and the bank does this with our cash management group, and we're happy to sit down with anybody and review these and review them with the teams. Present these examples of fraud, and then put policies and procedures to try to control or prevent those. It's all about education and communication, and then recognizing those fraud indicators and red flags. If we've all probably changed our address at the bank and then tried to get a new debit card, and they won't send it out to you in a certain period of time because that's a red flag. So, any change of payment amount or payment location, payment type, just a good thing to make you go, let's verify and take that next step to protect everybody. And then review the steps to report suspected and actual fraud within the company. Continued best practices are to review the internal controls and procedures, establish limits per action and each employee. We have the ability with our system, dual control within your company. One person clicks on an ACH or wire, another person needs to approve it. That kind of comes back to that using the fraud tools in the way that they're meant to be set up. It can be frustrating. We're all busy and okay, we'll just send the check out. So maybe if you do that for 5,000 or under, it's okay. But if you start to make larger payments or larger transfers, 2 sets of eyes and some time to discern on those that's important. Separating responsibilities. Again, one person creates the wire, another approves it. One person reconciles the accounts, a different person runs through the positive pay reports. And then this one's probably a little aggressive, but when there's real money involved and if requiring approval on all payments going out. Some of our clients do that where they just run a check run once a month, every other Friday, approve those ACHs and just have payable days. But it helps just to get that process set up. And then this one's redundant, but we've talked about it before. Reconcile activity daily. Very important. And if you see a bad actor or something in there, we really have a successful outcome if we're notified within the first 24 hours. Okay, I'm a bad clicker apparently. So just some verification. These are pretty basic, but I think as we get busy, verify the changes in payment information by picking up the phone and calling, kind of going old school, out of band from the way that it originally came in. Similar to what Reed talked about sending the encrypted file and then the next email that goes through is the password. We see that quite a bit. Obtain approval from multiple employees before adding a new vendor. In the banking world, we have to underwrite our vendors and make sure, thankfully I don't have to do that, we have smarter people than me, but you have to go through that, check out what are their processes and procedures and have that contract. So those are good, just best practices to ask what they're doing as well. Verifying payments requested via phone or an email. We'll call back to that number on file. Similar to somebody calling in or sends in a wire request, we have to do a callback on the number we have on the system, just to make sure that we're all legit and it's not a fraudulent transaction. And then this is a really good one, is just obtain approval from your management team for larger payments going out the door. Wires typically, once they leave the bank, it's guaranteed funds and they can be very hard to get back. Online banking and security. Our online banking setup is it's an administrator environment. So the people have the ability to give access permissions. This one's really important. Only give them the ability to do things that should be in their control. Don't give them the whole checkbook for the company. And then dual control for those higher risk functions, wires and ACHs. And the next bullet kind of talks about that. But with dollar limits, whatever your risk tolerance is up to, but make sure you have multiple users. And then cell phones, just make sure that they're secured. And one-time passcodes or biometrics. We have that set up in the system where you get the password, you go into the app, log into our online banking. Very similar, just make sure, and I guess I should have put this one on here, but don't ever give your password to the online banking to the bookkeeper. Make sure you set them up as their own user. Don't put them in that position, and it also it puts the company at risk. One more, boy, I'm a bad singer. So there's several different tools that businesses can put in place to mitigate this risk. The first two are very similar. This is anytime, well, I'm gonna back up. Anytime you write a check and send it out, the person you've sent that check to has your account number and routing number. And checks aren't hard to get. You can jump online and order checks and have them by tomorrow. So check positive pay is where when you write a batch of checks, you upload a file to your bank, And then only the items that you've listed, that you've written, will clear that account. Any other checks get pushed off into a non-post exception, and then somebody would have to physically go in and click through those to say, oh yeah, we forgot to do this. Or we see several times where one owner has a checkbook and they're, a petty cash check gets written or something kind of out of the ordinary course. So that's important. That's a great first step. Payee positive pay takes that one step further, where it not only looks at the check number and dollar amount, but it actually scans who the check was written to. So this goes back to the wash check scenario that we saw earlier. Right dollar amount, right check number, but the person had washed the check, changed the payee, and it cleared the system. With payee positive pay, that would have been caught and rejected because it wouldn't have been the right payee. Next one, more when you get into the electronic side, is ACH positive pay and ACH filters. ACH positive pay is similar to the check. It's just when you issue an ACH payment, it checks to make sure that the dollar amount is right and the person that was supposed to receive those funds is receiving those funds. On the ACH filter, it's an overlay that you can put on your accounts. We can either do a complete block, so certain accounts you don't allow any ACHs, or only the people that you do business with can clear and pull funds out of that account. Those are very important and pretty very user friendly. The last two, with daily reconciliation, again, I sound like a broken record, but someone should look at that account every day, every morning on what's been written, just to run through the items. Less important to do if you've got the top 3 bullet points, but still important to make sure that nothing looks out of the ordinary. And the final one is the low-tech version, but if you're writing checks, if you use a gel ink pen, it can't be washed. It'll destroy that check stock if they're trying to change out the payee. So that's a pretty low-tech way to, if you have to write some checks, to protect yourself. I think that's it. We'll open it up for questions. Oh.
Thank you, Pete. Again, a lot of good best practices that we should all be following in a great checklist. Does anybody have any questions when it comes to banking? Because we're all doing it for our businesses. Okay. Thank you, Pete. There's a lot of good information. Thank you so much. Okay, we will move on to insurance and protection this way. So, Zach, it's for you.
Great. Thank you. Nothing like closing out on insurance. Everyone's topic they all love to discuss. So my name is Zach Freeman, and I'm with the Christensen Group. We're an independent insurance agency with roughly 220 employees out of Eden Prairie, and we work around the country. We're 100% ESOP. My background is I was an underwriter for 5 years in the cyber liability space, as well as management liability and professional liability. And I've been at Christensen Group now for 10 years. And I am our current segment leader for cyber liability. So today we're going to, talk through multiple things related to the insurance side, and we'll take it through there. And if you have any questions, please type something into the chat and we can go from there. But with that, let's just talk about a brief overview of too much here of cyber insurance in general. So what it's really made up of. So it really breaks into 2 parts. You have the first party and the third party. First party are coverages that you are paying firsthand yourself. There's a kind of a laundry list of items there. But things like breach response and ransomware, business interruption, if the trigger for coverage is a cyber related claim that shuts your business down, any firsthand costs that you have, forensics, things of that nature. And then we have third party costs, which are liability costs. So a third party, whether it's a government entity or, your customers or vendors who are coming after you because you've lost their information, their data, things of that nature. So that kind of covers the two broader buckets. Looking at policy types, now there's really three ways you can go about cyber coverage. The first is self-insuring and just having no coverage. It's not something we would recommend, but it is a choice that some insureds make. Another is having coverage built into your package policy or your BOP, your business owner's policy. Again, this is something that I think is a bit of a false sense of security, because most policies will have some small limit built in where people feel like I have coverage, so I should be good. When in reality, it's maybe 50,000 or 100,000 in coverage, and the terms are very limited. Those policies are really not built to cover the intricacies of a cyber claim. So not one I would recommend either. And the last option is a standalone, robust cyber policy, which will or should include all of the things listed here as separate insuring agreements. Because typically when a claim comes in, it's not just triggering one of these items. Maybe you have a ransomware event where your business is shut down. So there's a business interruption piece. There's a forensic piece to figure out how somebody got in and are they still in. Maybe there's a data restoration piece. There could be public relations. There could be breach notification. And so there's a lot of items that play into a claim, and you just want to make sure you have a standalone and robust policy. And another thing that just like to mention as well, in terms of having a standalone robust policy, is just having limits that are the same kind of across the board. Now, there are certain areas like the cybercrime, the computer fraud, funds transfer fraud, social engineering, invoice manipulation, the telecom fraud, where those will almost always be sublimited. But you really don't want to pick and choose on the insuring agreements. I never recommend for insureds to say, you know what, we're going to skip communications and media liability because we don't think we have much exposure there. The additional premium to add it at full limits is minimal, and it's something that you should just look at as a comprehensive policy with similar limits across the board. With that, we'll move on to the next slide. So as far as the cyber markets, let me just talk about a quick overview of where the cyber market is and where it's come from. So in the 90s is when the cyber insurance product was developed. AIG had the first policy, but it really was developed through the London markets. And it's evolved quite a bit from there. But it really took off after the Target breach. And then, you had a lot of insureds or businesses that were looking at this type of coverage who before were declining it or not even talking about it, who are now taking a look and purchasing it, which has been a good thing. Many insureds feel like they're too small to have cyber insurance. Like they'll say, we're not Target, we're not worried about a breach. But in reality, the criminals don't care, and they're usually not targeting specific companies. A couple things. One is Target or larger organizations have a lot more resources put into cybersecurity and to make sure that they can avoid situations. But as you've seen in the media and whatnot, very hard to do, and the criminals are usually ahead of the reactionary controls and procedures that are being put in place. But also, the criminals are usually just throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks. So, they may throw out thousands of phishing emails and just wait for someone to come back. We've advanced past the, Prince of Cameroon asking for funds to help them out. So we've gone beyond that. But you can see sort of where the general costs are. And again, I don't need to read through this slide. You can read through it on your own. But just to give you an idea of the claim dollars that we're talking about and sort of what we're seeing in the marketplace. And those dollar figures are really only moving upward with the cost of litigation and just how many more claims are entering the marketplace. All right, so the incident cost, the cost of a claim, it's kind of broken down again in this matrix. It's hard to do, any sort of benchmarking really. This information, sort of take it with a grain of salt because there's just so much information that they're pulling from and much larger companies. I mean, for nano revenue is under 50 million. That's a pretty large swath of companies out there. So hard to determine, but a good basis to give you an idea of sort of, limits you should be looking at and the potential for claims here. And just so you're aware, the cost to an insurance carrier for, personally identifiable information, one record to an insurance carrier costs upwards of $150 per record, for as it plays into the claim in terms of breach notification and all the things that go into that. And for personal health information, it's upwards of $230 per record. So if you're a company that deals in the healthcare space, or you're getting a lot of information on that side of the house, just know that you are at higher risk and for costlier claims. As far as the cause of cyber claims, right now ransomware is at an all-time high. And even worse than, there were some controls and procedures that were put in place that I'll talk a little bit more about in a slide or two a few years ago. And, then the number of ransomware claims went down and they've since ticked up in the past year. So those are kind of number one for severity and frequency. But the most frequent, although not as severe, is the business email compromise piece. So we're seeing a lot of that. And those are, where you get an email, maybe the CFO gets an email from the owner, the CEO saying, hey, I know we've been working on this deal and it's about to close. Can you, send the X amount of dollars to this bank or routing number, and they go ahead and release the funds because this is a deal they've been talking about and everything tracks and it's from the CEO. But in reality, you have a hacker that had been watching the emails going back and forth and waiting for the right time to strike. And they are willfully releasing funds, even if they're duped. And so, that has been happening a lot. And we have insureds that are like, this, will never happen to us, or I get these emails all the time. But you'd be surprised at the number of claims that we see on that end of the house. So let's see. Mitigation steps, human error is, I know it's been mentioned by others on the panel today, but you can't downplay that fact. So as much training as you can do, whether it's using an outside vendor or like KnowBe4 is a good, they have good training videos and whatnot. But yeah, trying to get, regular training in front of your staff is important and can be crucial to having a loss or not. Working with your outside providers and professionals and seeing what resources they have. I mean, your insurance broker, your insurance carrier, and your MSP. I mean, there's a plethora of resources out there that you have the ability to utilize that you may not even be aware of. So reach out to your providers and just see, what's out there and what makes sense for your organization. Another thing just wanted to mention as well is have a hard copy of your incident response plan. We've seen numerous times where companies have a very robust incident response plan. They've ran through it. They know what to do. And then an incident happens typically on a Friday afternoon and they can't access their system and they can't go through their incident response plan because they're shut out. They don't have a hard copy of it and they can't access the information. So just keep in mind, make sure you have a hard copy and know where that is. And then the other piece is having a standalone, robust cyber policy. Something that I mentioned a few slides ago, but not all cyber policies are created equal, and it's very important that you understand what you're buying, and that your broker has a deep understanding of what it is in an ever-changing marketplace. Again, this is more on the mitigation steps. This takes it a little bit deeper and breaks it down into the assess, plan, and recover framework. Something to consider and make sure that you're, doing all components of this. On the planning exercises, it's not just the incident response, but also disaster recovery, the business continuity, and the vulnerability management. So again, something you can work through with your various providers, but important stuff to be considering, and stuff to do take a day to do a dry run of this stuff. Okay, we have a breach, we can't access our data. What now? Have your leaders, your IT people on board, and take the time to do that, because it really goes a long way in when something actually does happen, and you'll be much better prepared. I can't tell you it's still going to be easy, because it will take you out of your day-to-day for a number of days, but it will be significantly easier if you've planned and prepped for the worst. So as far as controls necessary for a robust cyber policy, there's a laundry list of items here, and things that you should be aware of, or maybe you already are, depending on if you've tried to get standalone cyber coverage. But, everything you see on this list pretty much 2 years ago was a best in class. And if you had this, wonderful. And, the underwriters would love that you had all this stuff in place. But 2 years ago, all you needed to have a bindable quote was, all they needed was your company name, your address, and your revenue. And, they would spit out a quote, and it was very easy. With all the ransomware attacks, pretty much overnight, the carriers started requiring all this stuff as really minimum requirements for coverage. Now, depending on the size organization that you have, you may not need all of this, but you will have to have many of it in place. I know MFA is a big item, and it has made a difference on the severity and frequency of the ransomware attacks. But something that you should definitely be considering or looking at. If you don't have all this stuff in place, you may not be able to get full limits on things like ransomware, and so something to think about, and should really look at putting this stuff in place. In terms of recommendations, again, like I mentioned, not all policies are created equal, and not all agents or brokers are either. I mean, most forms for work comp, general liability, property, for a package or a BOP policy are on what's called ISO forms. So they're all the same for every carrier. And that is not the case for cyber, management liability, or professional liability. They're all similar, but different, and the devil's in the details. And you just want to make sure that whatever you're buying, you're confident in, and you understand what you're getting, and more importantly, maybe what you're not getting. Making sure you have adequate limits and sublimits. Again, you want to be purchasing all the insuring agreements that are available, and getting all the bells and whistles on the policies. And to go with that, I'm of the mind that if you're not with a London-based carrier, either your premium or your coverage is likely inadequate to what the market is providing. And so, carriers that are through London, I just feel like they tend to be cheaper and broader. The coverage is better, and you're getting more with the policy. There is a slight downside with the non-admitted or surplus lines carriers through London, and that could be, they could non-renew you a week before renewal, whereas a standard market isn't able to do that, or there's no protection if they go bankrupt, although they're all heavily capitalized and not overly concerned from that perspective. But I would say the pros outweigh the cons on having a London-based carrier with your policy. And Let's see. Some of the other, I just wanted to also mention, when we were prepping for this call, I had a good question from the panel in terms of, common cyber exclusions. What are some things to sort of be aware of? And thought I would mention that here as well. Intellectual property is typically not covered. And usually you need a separate policy for that. So, trademark infringement, copyright infringement, all of that would be covered, but intellectual property in particular is typically excluded. So something to be aware of if you either have a lot of IP or deal with someone else's IP. So something to be aware of there. Dependent business interruption is a really big piece. Now, that would be if you depend on an outside vendor to keep you up and running, and they are shut down because of a cyber attack. If you have one of these robust standalone policies, you'll have dependent business interruption coverage, and that will cover you for, that type of loss. However, 90% of the policies are only covering dependent business interruption for tech-related companies. So, payroll providers or cloud providers, MSPs, cybersecurity, outside vendors, those types of providers. If you have a vendor or if you have a company that you rely on outside of the tech field, and if they go down, if that's problematic for your business, your broker needs to understand that. And there are endorsements that can be added to the policy to cover non-tech related businesses if they're down. But usually you're going to need a specific endorsement to do so. So, be aware when you see on your deck page, if it says, contingent business interruption or dependent business interruption, that probably is only related to IT related vendors. Obviously any sort of fraud, criminal act, dishonest act, perpetuated by, the insured, someone who's signing off on the applications, leadership, that sort of thing is never covered, for really any policy, but something to be aware of as well. And then the other thing worth mentioning, it's not really under the exclusions per se, but as soon as an incident happens, your first call, maybe your second call, first call maybe to your attorney, but your first or second call should be to your insurance broker, or look directly on your cyber policy. Usually it's on one of the first couple pages, but there's a number to call that's a 24/7 hotline to get the claim filed and get things in motion. Because what we see happen occasionally is insureds who, particularly it can be their IT person who isn't involved in the insurance purchase, and they might be aware they have insurance, but they're really stressed out. They're getting bombarded internally with people being like, I can't access my email, or we're shut down, or what are you going to do? And so they'll start pulling levers, right? They'll shut down the system or do things which is, it could have an impact on your coverage, and something that you really want to consider. And you need to get the carrier involved right away. I mean, they have professionals, they have a team of people that will jump in and point you in the right direction. So don't try to settle things right off the bat and then expect the insurance carrier to come in and fix things on the back end. It's not like a property claim where you have a leak and you need to get someone in there to stop the leak right away and then deal with the insurance. On the cyber side, get them in right away and then, go from there. So I believe that's all I have for you. Does anyone have any questions or comments or concerns that they would like to discuss? I covered it all, Lisa. I guess nobody's got anything for me.
Well, I think that it is clear that there are so many dimensions to protecting our businesses from this very real threat of cyber incidents, and the attacks are in the news, and they're costly financially from a time interruption in business, and can impact our relationships. So awareness is our first defense, and then enacting these best practices that, you all have shared. So I thank you, Eric and Reed and Blake and Zach and Pete, for providing so much valuable information. You've also connected how each of your disciplines, and your focuses relate to. It starts with IT and putting best practices in place, all the way through sharing what is the impact and the response if something were to happen. So thank you very much. We do have our presenters here. So now that we've seen the spectrum of the focus on where we start and then how we respond, does anybody have any questions, comments?
I have a question. This was a really great presentation. It's so much information to take in at once. Are you guys going to be sharing this recording so we can reference it again?
Yes. Yes. So not only will we share the recording, but we will also share the slide deck. We'll correct a few things or add a few things that were mentioned in the presentation. But yes, and you will have the list of all the contact information from each of these presenters, because we're hearing from the best in the business. So Whitfley, Teal, Fellhaber and Larson, Christensen Group, Platinum Bank, and so yes, we'll provide all this because it was a wealth of information. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Well, we had until 1 o'clock, but we can give everyone the gift of time, 15 minutes back in your day. Again, thank you, Eric and Reed and Blake and Zach and Pete, for bringing your expertise and sharing it here with us. It's appreciated. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm glad that you were able to join us today, and I wish you well in all of your efforts to just secure your organization the best possible, knowing that the impact would be real, on our businesses. Okay.